All right, good afternoon. I think we'll get started here. My name is Lynn Anderson. I have the privilege of being the co-chair with Steve Nemi of the Ilar Roundtable series that is sponsoring this wonderful event. And we certainly heard some very interesting and perhaps a little bit provocative presentations this morning. We're going to start off this afternoon by maybe just looking back a little bit and considering some other initiatives that have been undertaken to try to address the reproducibility factor. So I'd like to introduce as our first speaker my colleague Jeff Everitt, who's from GlaxoSmithKline.
I'd like to start by thanking not just the organizers of the meeting, but also the Ilar staff. One thing I did learn in my years on Ilar Council is how hard the staff works. And anybody that's tried to put out any of these reports of any size, even the really small ones, realizes it's a tremendous activity and it puts a lot of work on the staff. I'd also like to thank Dr. Begley. I have 5 candy bars up here. I have no questions, but anybody that falls into a postprandial funk, I have a pretty good arm. So I was the chair of a committee, and I didn't know what to talk about. Lita never got back to me till last minute and just wrote the abstract for me, and basically I think what she wanted was sort of a historical view of what we did and maybe an after-action review. So that's the way I'm going to approach it and just share a few of my thoughts about this committee. And this was a committee that I chaired. It consisted of several of us that were laboratory animal veterinarians, so Steve Barthold, Steve Smith, Timo Nevalainen, and then Mary Waltham, who was a publishing consultant who helped us in our efforts to try to navigate our way through the journal editorial processes. But I'm going to paint a very sad story of what happened over the course of this committee, where essentially we were scooped by the arrival of the ARRIVE guidelines. We didn't know each other was working on this, and so they collided all about the same time. And there were other groups working as well with the so-called gold standard checklist. And there were, it seemed like for 25 years, everybody left well enough alone of the original checklist, and then it seemed like in the same 3-month period of time, everybody decided to tackle this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this project at Ilar. It started in the end of 2009, and most of this information is all on the Ilar website. And the statement of task was that the committee would prepare a short report aimed at editors of journals. And what it was to try to do is set out some background information for why it would be important to properly describe animal research in materials and methods of journal articles. And what we started to do on this committee is try to get a sense of what was out there among the journals currently, and then how could we augment what we thought might be needed and put some guidance out there. And so the project was, basically, it was basically to try to put scientific underpinning and put sort of the reputation of the National Academies and of Ilar behind this effort, and hope that that would help get it embraced within the research community. But one of the things that we recognized as a committee, and one of the things we felt strongly about at the beginning of the project, and probably also at the end of the project, and something that I want to just espouse a personal opinion of, is that the reproducibility issue is what we thought was central to what we were trying to do, and that often gets wrapped up into lots of other issues of animal welfare. And there are many, many important ethical issues to deal with and many important animal welfare issues to deal with in publication of studies. But the scientific reproducibility issue is the one that we thought was getting unraveled in the welfare issues. And all of us on the committee that were from the U.S. felt it was particularly important because in the U.S., the 3 R's culture is not separated out in the minds of investigative staff the way that it is in the UK and in the EU. So we felt it was important to try to tackle this from a reproducibility standpoint. And this was in the background context and issues, and I highlighted some of this from the Ilar website, so you can see this issue. And we hope to try to make the biggest impact on journal editors. We felt as a group that editors really held the key. And I still feel that one of the things we need to think about in sort of how we can implement guidelines, because my bottom line is I've come to the realization that it's not the checklist and not the guideline, it's really the implementation of something different and the change in the culture that really has to take place. And unfortunately, the implementation plans have not been as strong as sometimes the efforts to develop the guideline itself. And so I think when we're done with the session, the meeting this week, one of the things for us to think about collectively as a research community is, okay, everybody knows what's important to put in a paper. The question now is, how do you get that implemented into the existing research culture and into the publishing culture and make it a value-added proposition? And then convince journal editors that it truly will help with the reproducibility problem. And there were a number of key messages. I'm not going to read each of these, but central to it is the journal editors have a key role. We also felt that it was important for reproducibility. When we went through the literature, we felt that certainly if experiments aren't properly described, they're not going to be able to be reproducible. They're not one and the same. But obviously, for reproducibility, they have to have well-described experiments. We also had a lot of challenge debating as a group about, okay, there's limited, somebody called it limited acreage in the journals. You know, there's limited ability to really get into the details. You can't put your whole animal care and use program into a journal article. What is important to put in that journal article? And it's not the same for every type of study and every field of research or for every journal. And so there has to be the embracement by editors to customize position papers for their particular journals. And not every type of animal study has the same degree of factors that induce that variability. Many of us, I come from a lab animal medicine background, many of us are doing preclinical imaging studies now, and if you conduct preclinical imaging studies, you know there are a whole variety of factors that impart probably the most variability in preclinical imaging studies that aren't even listed in the gold checklist. And you know, I don't think the answer is to make a platinum checklist. I think the answer is to really get embracement by journals to customize what their needs are in a value-added way for reproducibility. The messages are not unique that have come out of our report. Our report was just trying to give some documentation around these messages and try to put the weight of the national academies to the issue. And like I say, in the middle of the project, 2 papers came out. The one from Carol Kilkenny from the NC3Rs that really, I think, put a solid underpinning to the fact that on the ground in a practical way, studies aren't being reported adequately. And then the other paper that came out obviously was the ARRIVE guidelines. And at that point, we connected between NC3Rs and our committee, and we tried to coordinate some of the rollout of the message at meetings, and we incorporated the ARRIVE guidelines into our report. So they are present in our report as an appendix, and I have seen a number of citations where groups have taken it that Ilar has embraced the ARRIVE guidelines, which I think we did do as a committee. We realized that, you know, the ARRIVE guidelines were put out in a much more robust way with a better state of implementation. And I think the learning that I took away is that you really had to get journals and funding agencies on board, and they listed it on the website. They kept tallies, they were building it up, and I think they really solicited a number of editorials in a number of journals. And that was something that our group didn't do for a variety of reasons, one of which the leadership of Ilar was switching at the time, and a lot of things were happening within Ilar. And a number of us that were on this subcommittee rotated off council. But I do think that now that I've seen the papers come out on the fact that the Arrive guidelines aren't being implemented to the extent that the research community, or at least aspects of the research community had hoped, I think it does speak to the fact that implementation plans really need to be addressed in a much more robust way. And there were, at the same time in 2010, and this was a one-year project, the gold standard publication checklist came out. Now, I know this isn't going to be received well, but I'm going to say it anyway. In the United States, no matter what anybody says, having the checklist come out of the Alternatives to Lab Animal Journal wasn't seen as the most politically correct way to get the embracement of the research community. And I would say that it's going to be very, very important. As a sort of a sidebar to where it really struck me is I sit on the editorial board of one of the lab animal journals in the U.S., and they wouldn't endorse the Arrive guidelines. And I was, apoplectic in the editorial board meeting. But they didn't know what it meant to endorse it, and they felt, well, this, what's in an experiment is just self-evident. Does this mean that we're going to have to put 3 R's implications to every biology article that an author submits? What does it mean to endorse the guidelines? So there needed to be maybe a little bit more country-specific education, I would say. I think the culture in the research community in the U.S. is different than the culture in the research community in the U.K. around the use of animals, and it's our system, personal licenses versus IACUCs, and that has to be acknowledged in some way as we go forward with an implementation. And I really think that there's going to be a lot of challenges. Now, some of the challenges I put here, there has to be guidance, I think, to editors, authors, and reviewers, but I found in the journals that I sit on editorial boards, it's really best, I think, if there's really a robust use of checklists by reviewers. If reviewers have to actually account back to editors in some way that, it's not a passive system, it's an active system. It's not, well, I looked at the guidelines and yeah, pretty much they're within the guidelines. It should be, if you're going to use a checklist, it should be sort of done as a checklist. And I think if the review process was changed, then the way authors used guidelines would be different. But I would say that, the complexity of the plethora of journals, the complexity of readouts, the types of studies, it's not one size fits all. And there are many, many guidelines out there that have impact on either readouts that animals are used in or the animals themselves. The other is, how do you put the supplementary information out there? Where does it sit? Who's in charge of it? What are you going to do with all this non-peer-reviewed supplementary information? And what are going to be all the complex problems that arise around that? Well, one thing I did have the opportunity to do when I chaired this committee is I spoke to a lot of editors. And I can tell you that at least 5 years ago, some of the editors of really major journals, and I was on the program with some of them. I was on the program with editor from the Journal of Immunology, and didn't really see that the animal issue is a big issue to his journal. And as a lab animal vet, I was looking and I was thinking, gosh, it'd be nice if only about half your papers even mention what the substrain is. All of us in lab animal medicine know that a C57 black isn't a C57 black. You got to go beyond that. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done, but I think it could be best done in a value-added way around each field and around each journal. And with the caveat that obviously there are standard things such as the 20 items in the Arrive guidelines that really do need to be addressed in a comprehensive way. I do think this last one is extremely important. I think that, the ethical issues and how we look at the ethical issues of animal use have to be separated from the scientific issues of reproducibility. And I think to get traction, at least in parts of the U.S. research community, to really get traction, I think any scientist will rally around the data. You show them the holes in the data, they'll make a course correction. You get into all the issues of 3 Rs, and you get into all the issues of animal ethics, and everybody has a different opinion. And so I do think that there needs to be a little bit of separation of these issues more than has been in the past. That's just my own personal opinion while I have the bully pulpit up here. This is something I think does make sense to me, you know, to take general guidelines and to make specific ones for areas of research. And I kind of like this one on methods descriptions for preclinical imaging models. And there's a lot of aspects in here that aren't in the arrived guidelines, but some of the aspects in here cause the biggest degree of variability on preclinical imaging studies. So to approach this in very specific ways, very value-added ways, I think is the way to go. And that was one of the chief learnings I took away from it. And you know, I know it's going to be controversial in this group, but I'm going to come out and say it. This poster, I believe strongly. I'm a lab animal vet. I've spent my career on animal welfare. I believe strongly in excellence in animal welfare. But while good animal welfare and good animal science go hand in hand, they're not one and the same. And I think that is a message that somehow has to get to the research community as well. They're both important, but they're different. There's also some things we didn't do, and in part of the after-action review, I think it's important to note that in some of the changes that took place in Ilar. And one of the things we said we were going to do in the report itself was this, that we would try to have website support for journals and try to keep track of which journals were endorsing, which professional societies, and that type of thing. And I think that's important. I know that NC3Rs is doing that. And that's something I think we can strengthen up even at this late juncture, you know, at Ilar. So some of the issues for me, we need to find the space in journals for the details, and we have to decide, I think, in different fields, what's the degree of detail that's needed. The devil's in the details. You know, we're sitting at lunch, and I know that we were talking about, you know, are we going to have to do gender equality now across biology studies with the NIH initiative? But I was sitting there thinking from 3 weeks ago, are we going to have to say what the gender of the person that takes the readout is? Because you all saw the popular press that, you know, the Bruce effect in mice seems to be being induced by male applicators, at least in pain research. So I don't know if that's going to hold up, but say it does. If it does, then at least in pain research, or at least in certain readouts, maybe that's the important thing that imparts variability and a lack of reproducibility. I do think focusing on reviewers is going to be important, and finding champions. You know, seeing Alice here, I know we engage some professional societies as we were getting involved in doing our report, and one of them was the American Physiological Society, and their journals are very strong. And you know, one thing that wasn't stated in the training efforts, I personally, over my career in lab animal medicine, I've seen a shift as people are trained in molecular biology as opposed to physiology. They become much less cognizant of some of the things that induce variability on readouts in animal studies. The molecular biologist isn't going to be as quick to blind animals as physiologists may be. And I've noticed that in some cases it's not a one-size-fits-all. And one of the things that's important, and I know I learned this from the APS journals, having champions within the professional societies and within the editorial cadre of major journals, I think, can help sway the effort. And I don't think we've spent enough effort at that. And like I say, the implementation plan is what we were particularly weak on, I think, in the Ilar effort. And that's something that as we go forward from this meeting, I think we really need to think about what's the focus going to be specifically, what would those sort of biteable bits of next steps be, and then how are we going to measure success? And that's where I think we don't have a handle of, we're starting to get a little handle maybe since the publishing of the guidelines, but there hasn't really been a good concerted effort. Now, I personally would like to throw out one thing. I do think that challenge in the biology community could become more robust around animal models using social media. I do think that if we're talking about having lots of non-peer-reviewed material going around papers, such as supplemental information, we can also start getting different laboratories inputting to animal models. They may not have studies, and they may not be trying to repeat the study in question, but I think it would mean something if, if animal models started to become really critiqued. And there's a lot of things that aren't being shared. There's a lot of information, knowledge that's out there that doesn't get published, but that becomes sort of the street cred around certain models. And there has to be some better way to getting that challenge in the system so that we can start to get a little bit more robust description. So with that, I'll stop and we'll wait until afterward, I guess, to take questions together.
Thank you, Jeff. Our next speaker also chaired an Ilar committee, and I'd like to introduce Coenraad Hendriksen, who's with the Netherlands Vaccine Institute.
Okay, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be in Washington at Ilar. It feels like coming home. I've been in Ilar Council for quite a number of years. And, well, I always liked to be involved in the activities of Ilar. I have to apologize. Someone said this morning I'm an outlier in this audience. I think I'm an outlier as well, as the English is not my mother's language. So I have to apologize for my broken English. Let me start with that. Well, I've been asked to say a few words about another workshop being organized by Ilar, Animal Research in a Global Environment, Meeting the Challenges. The meeting was organized in 2008, and I think we still didn't have the economic crisis, so there was a lot of traveling in the world because there was a lot of economy. Well, in fact, the 2008 workshop was the third of a series of workshops which all had more or less the same goal. Two other workshops are indicated over here. In 2003, there was a workshop, an international workshop on the development of science-based guidelines for laboratory animal care. And in 2007, a workshop organized, I believe it was in Como, Italy, on the regulatory guidance documents of several countries. And in fact, all three workshops had as the same line that they were aiming at standardizing animal experimentation in the world. To give you a little bit information about the workshop, the objective of the workshop we had in 2008 was to identify and promote a better understanding of the challenges of conducting animal research across country boundaries. And well, the background, as I just indicated, was that companies, particularly since a few decades, all big pharma companies are now global companies. Also, academic is going international, so research is getting global. Researchers are traveling the world, and animals are traveling the world, and even the regulatory requirements are more and more getting global. Well, some facts and figures. The workshop was held in Washington on September 23 to 25, 2008. We had about 200 participants coming from 17 countries with invited presentations and discussions. And there were a number of priority topics being discussed in this meeting. Well, in preparing this presentation, and I received information about that from the organizers. There were two provocative messages from the organizers for preparing this presentation, and these are indicated over here. Highlight why previous ILAR efforts to guide a better and more objective approach to animal use has not addressed the reproducibility issue. And the second one was the impact of these efforts has not met expectations as concerns about reproducibility have grown rather than lessened. Well, starting with the first one, animal research in a global environment. The core theme of that meeting was harmonization and standardization. And in fact, already indicated in the keynote lecture of Hilton Klein at that meeting, already indicated that harmonization and standardization particularly is meant to bring studies and to have studies more international and to be able to repeat and compare results of these studies when they are done in different places on different parts of the world. So Hilton said when we are doing studies in different laboratories in different countries with varying standards, the interpretation and integrity of these studies came into question. So he said there is a reproducibility problem when we do our studies in different places. Well, globalization, of course, would be a solution, harmonization and standardization of guidelines. I say that because the previous presentations this morning were more or less about harmonization, looking at the statistics, the experimental design, while we looked less on those aspects, but more on the other aspects. What factors are influencing the results of an animal experiment? And are these factors also contributing to the fact that you get different results when you perform the studies in different parts of the world? So we looked in our workshop at a different reason for non-reproducibility than perhaps that has been discussed this morning. Well, again, harmonization and standardization was discussed in great detail and information was presented by a number of organizations which are listed here in this slide, and I'm happy to see that there is now some collaboration between ILAR and the OIE, the World Organization for Animal Welfare, in getting standards more international and more harmonized. Well, one of the conclusions of that workshop was that harmonization does not mean standardization. Each country should maintain an animal welfare oversight system that reflects its own culture, tradition, religion, laws and regulations. And in fact, that is interesting. Come back to that in a minute. One of the reasons to say, well, we can't work with science-based standards in animal research is that we still have major gaps in our knowledge and science behind animal care and animal welfare. And as a consequence, a lack of consistency exists on what best practices are across various cultures. So we have to live with that, and the only thing we can do is not work with science-based standards, but nowadays with performance standards, and say, well, these are the core principles that we have to take into account, and we know there will be some flexibility, but at least we have some core principles. And an example of core principles was presented by Landy in 2008, given over here. And I think these principles are very general. They leave room for all kinds of interpretation, but at least you have a kind of baseline where you say, well, we all have to work according to these principles. Well, if you say harmonization is using general standards with a local flavor of culture, religion, tradition, regulations and laws, then the consequence is that reference for animal care and welfare is not only species-specific needs, but includes also the cultural context the animals are in. And at that workshop also there was a very interesting presentation of Bernard Rollin, who introduced the concept of telos. And he said, well, the telos is the fact that a rat just wants to be a rat, and he used the name ratness or pigness or whatever, and a rat lives to be a rat. And in that regard, of course, it is a bit strange to say, well, we have in fact references that not only take into account the needs of the animal, but also the culture the animals are in. I don't think there is something like a Buddhistic mouse or a Catholic rat or a Hindu primate. A rat is a rat, wherever it is in the world. So we have to work on needs that are specific for those specific animal species. And we have to work to that. Saying, well, culture is part of the way we look at the animals, I think is a perspective from a human being, not from an animal being. Well, the second provocative message was that the impact of these efforts has not met expectations, as concerns about reproducibility have grown rather than lessened. The question, of course, is this because animal research is becoming less reproducible, and then we have a serious problem if that is true, or because we become more aware of it the more we globalize? And I think it's particularly the last challenge. This morning by Dr. Niemi it was mentioned to look to see it as a sphere, and when the sphere increases, you also see that the surrounding, the borders will increase. Well, I think that's also this issue. We learn more about animal experiments, we learn more about variables we have in our animal studies, why they are not reproducible, and we gradually learn more about what the variables are within the animal experiments that cause differences in the results. And Jeff already gave a nice example of that, where the androgen hormones might play a role in that. Well, there was also a saying of Landy at the 2008 meeting that said, well, the weakest link in all our conversation is a conversation we don't have. It's much more important to talk and disagree than not speaking and believing that never the twain shall meet. And I think that's also very important for this meeting. Let's discuss things we not always agree, but at least we should find common grounds. Okay, another important aspect being discussed in the workshop was education and training. And it was said by Marilyn Brown that training and education are really the cornerstones of effective performance standards. And some proposals were being made how we could improve education and training in a global level, on a global level. And then, of course, the international organizations could play a role in that, a model a way of providing and make available teaching modules, continuing education, and also supervision by hands-on training. To me, and probably also to the rest of the group that attended the meeting, it's not only about being competent and have the competence to work with laboratory animals. It's also the attitude we have to work on, because the attitude determines whether we reflect on what we do, whether we challenge the traditions and be prepared to move forward. I think that's very important, and in my practical life as a laboratory animal vet in an institute, I see that quite often investigators are not really prepared to do that. They do what they did before and they continue to do so, but I think reflection on what we do is a key issue. Promoting animal welfare was being discussed in the workshop. And promoting good welfare is an important part of delivering good and ethically justified science, already mentioned by Jeff a few minutes ago. That's true. I think a very nice example of in what way providing not good science, not just ethical justified science, in what way it can influence your experiment was given by Matt Leach at the same conference. They did a survey looking at the use of pain-killing drugs in animal experiments, and they found that in quite a number of cases where pain relieving drugs would have been needed, that there were a number of reasons why people didn't use those pain-killing drugs. Well, take into account that there are differences, quite often not reported in publications. And definitely these differences in attitudes between different countries, between different institutes, might have resulted in deviating results from previous studies. So also for that reason, it's very important in order to increase the reproducibility of results, to try to exclude those kind of more non-scientific based arguments not to use pain-killing drugs. Well, an issue being discussed at the workshop in 2008, and what already was indicated by Lida, that there will be shortly a roundtable conference on transportation. We discussed it also. We had a number of people from air flight companies, but also from other companies. One of the statements was that flying humane primates is cheaper than flying non-human primates. I think that's true. But I think that the workshop has not been very productive in that way, and the outcome has not been taken up because it's still worldwide a problem, the transport of laboratory animals. And I just included an article from the UK where you can see that British medical research is under threat as various BOTO activists to halt the import of animals for laboratory animal testing. So I think there is a really an urgent need to discuss what exactly the conditions should be for the transport of laboratory animals and how we can improve these things. Well, coming to my last slide, the workshop did address harmonization and standardization as such, indirectly also the reproducibility of the research. I think that our workshop was not output driven in a sense that we said, well, there have to be a number of follow-up actions. Those were not defined during the workshop, but there were a great number of recommendations to standardize animal testing, having best practices, performing standards, education, training, and improving animal welfare. I think that's there's no one for all solution. Also already mentioned today. Reproducibility can be improved by using robust models and science-based standards. Well, I included a cartoon. I think it expresses well. I guess that all of us want to go in the same direction. Improving, and Jeff already indicated, improving science and improving animal welfare. It can go hand in hand. But quite often we do it from a different position on the car, and we all push to the car and nothing will happen. So meetings like this, and meetings like we had in 2008, discuss things with the experts, with the group, and try to get to a consensus would be a possibility to push the car from one direction. And that was my last slide. Thanks for your attention.
Okay. We have time for just a few questions. If you and Jeff want to have a seat up front here. Do I see any questions? You want to come to the, Margaret, yeah, thank you.
I am Margaret Landy. So I understand Bernie Rowland's concept of telos, you know, and the ratness of the rat and the pigness of the pig. But from both of your perspectives, using your professional judgment, how do you see there are cultural differences, and how will that affect a solution, if it's possible, for the topic we're discussing today, which is reproducibility in experiments? Already we have two examples of where there were slightly different tactics taken with the ARRIVE guidelines versus the Ilar guidelines, and then the gold standard out of the Netherlands. So how do we sort of bring this together?
Well, I think the reason,
Can you press your...
The reason why Bernard Rowland introduced the concept of telos was, of course, looking at the needs of an animal species, or substrain or whatever. And I think that was a very valid argument to say, well, we have to go from the perspective of the animal to see in what way we can improve. So I think one of the reasons at the moment to say, well, we can't do that is because there is still a lack of knowledge about what the needs of the different animal species are. So I think, first of all, there's a scientific need to improve our understanding of the laboratory animals. Secondly, of course, we have to deal with the fact that there are cultural differences in the way we look at laboratory animals. You can't deny them. You can't deny them also because you really don't have the science-based standards to say, well, this is the way we have to deal with the laboratory animals. If you would have, it would be more simple. At the moment, we don't have. So I think there is nothing else at the moment than accepting that people look at the animals from a different perspective, have different ideas. But in that perspective, I think it's very important to have at least performance standards to say, well, these are the baseline values. These are the values we have to take into account. And for the rest, we have to accept for the moment that there will be some flexibility in the way we interpret the standards, but we have to.
there another question? Yes. Can you go to the mic, please? And introduce yourself, please.
Bob Wirtz, NIH. I want to reinforce something that was said earlier, and that's that when you talk to journals, you really ought to concentrate on them in smaller groups. So, for example, I do neuroscience, and there are a group of neuroscience journals, and they almost always have publication boards that make the policy decisions. But the issues in neuroscience are somewhat different, that they're heavily related to behavior. They include primate behavior, and you'll be addressing questions that an immunology journal, for example, would have no interest in. The second point is that I think the point I took was that you don't want to go into policy issues like the 3 Rs, particularly with a journal, and I think that's quite correct, because I realize this is not the group to say this in, but most scientists acquiesce to the 3 Rs, and we understand why we come up with this, but there's not wild support for at least 2 of them. The refinement is fine, because if you sharpen your experiment, you'll get better results. The other 2 have problems that I think a lot of scientists have difficulty supporting it.
Well, the other issue I would try to put around that is I don't think we can do everything at once. And there's a lot of emotion around the animal issues, and for the reasons Margaret brought up, there's a lot of cultural and divisions around the world in anthropomorphism, and it's just an extremely emotional issue once you're dealing with, in vivo studies. Just the issues that Dr. Begley is talking about of positive controls in animal studies, I mean, that's going to raise completely different issues in the US and the UK in just the regulatory component of it. I think the issues of getting a handle on reproducibility in our journals, if we concentrate on the scientific issues of that and the data issues, I think it takes all the soft stuff out around anthropomorphism, and we're not going to be able to all approach anesthesia the same way just purely on the different drugs we use. I mean, so I do think biteable bits are going to be important, and I think those first bits ought to be to come back to the science, because all scientists, no matter where they are in the world, are bound by their data. They will do what they think is truly value added to enhance their data for reproducibility, I believe. They have all different attitudes toward the use of animals, though, and ethical perspectives.
David?
Okay. I'm David Kurtz, National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And I kind of agree with Jeff in that for what our goal is at this meeting in tackling reproducibility, we really do have to separate out animal welfare and science. I mean, I'm a laboratory animal veterinarian, and I think all of us in this field would agree one of our main roles is animal welfare, and we're providing animal welfare, but we all do it differently. We provide different diets, different housing conditions. That affects the science, that affects the reproducibility. And so we have to tease that out. I think in order to address that, with the previous Ilar guidelines were put out in publications, and trying to address it from a publication standpoint, there's not a lot of teeth to it. And in my opinion, I think the best way to do that is to start convincing those with the most power to bring about change. That's the funding agencies. That's the ones that say, if we're going to pay for this study, you're going to provide X, Y, and Z to make sure that your study is reproducible. And I think that's where we need to focus on these recommendations.
Thank you. I think we'll take one more, and then we'll move to the next talk.
Seems like somebody has to say what I'm going to say, and that is that I'm kind of concerned about the bracketing and the factoring out of the animal welfare issue that several of the speakers have alluded to. I wonder whether we don't make an artificial distinction there. We're perfectly willing to bracket out all kinds of issues we wouldn't experiment on prisoners, on human subjects, who wouldn't subject animals, primates particularly, to extraordinary pain. We've internalized those controls. So I wonder whether the highlighting the idea that we should externalize and not speak about the welfare issues, the use of animals in large numbers, whether that isn't an artifice and ought to be addressed more directly.
I'm only suggesting that different parts of the research process have a different part to play in the control. So I think institutions have a huge role to play there in animal care and use programs and in oversight of animal care and use programs. I'm only suggesting that for the implementation of better descriptions of animal research in journals, that we go to journal editors with the thought that we concentrate on those things that affect the data and the reproducibility of journal articles and not try to do everything together. I fully ascribe to the fact that in many, many cases, welfare issues and scientific issues are one and the same or tightly intertwined, but they're not across the board, and I think it's not allowing us in the U.S. to get the embracement of the research community around this issue, and we end up as lab animal scientists talking to each other.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.